I've often marveled at the fact that Thomas More, who's over my shoulder right here, his picture, was one of the most powerful men in the world as the Lord High Chancellor to King Henry VIII. But he also became a saint. So what about the idea of saints who were incredibly entrepreneurial? This should give we business owners and ministry heads some hope. Our topic today is a fascinating one: 6 lessons of entrepreneurial saints. Join me as I speak to entrepreneur and founder John Cannon of Cent Ventures on the Catholic Entrepreneur Podcast. I want to thank our sponsor of the show, Mission Advantage. If you're looking to place a senior level position in your Catholic ministry, Mission Advantage is your solution. You can find contact information in the show notes below. Our topic today is personal transformation as the key to business or ministry transformation. My guest is John Cannon. John is the founder of Cent Ventures, a community of Catholic founders and entrepreneurial leaders. He's also the founder and director of Monk Mindset, a ministry which helps people transform hectic lives into harmony. John holds degrees from Notre Dame, Harvard, and Oxford University. John was an investment banker as well as a policy advisor for a governor of Alabama. Perhaps most uniquely, John spent 7 years in monastic life as a Carmelite monk. Please welcome John Cannon.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Great to be here.
So we're going to have a fruitful discussion on the topic of certain Catholic saints who were really, really entrepreneurial. And that may seem a little bit like an oxymoron for people either in the church, but also maybe people in the world, but we're going to unpack that. John, we're going to start the show with 2 macro questions. And the reason why I want to do these macro questions is because I want our listeners to see the end first, to see the real value of what we're going to speak about. So you and I are, correctly impressed with what some people in Silicon Valley build, whether it's Uber or Airbnb or whatever the case may be. But there have been saints in Catholic history who have built some unbelievable things. Can you impress us with kind of a quick overview of what some saints have done in Catholic history?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. I was speaking to a group of CEOs recently, and I asked, if your company's been around for more than 500 years, I want you to raise your hand. And 0% of people in the room raised their hand. No one. And, these saints are building movements, entities, institutions, organizations that last hundreds, thousands of years. Wow. And they last longer than companies, countries, entire political systems. Why is that? I mean, there's something remarkable going on here. And so just take a few examples of that. Saint Benedict in the 500s founds the Benedictine order, writes the Rule of Saint Benedict. The order continues pretty similarly to how it did 1,500 years ago to this day. And there have been hundreds of thousands of Benedictine monks, oblates, nuns that have impacted millions and millions of people over a 1,500-year period. It's just remarkable. Take St. Ignatius of Loyola in the 1500s, founds the Jesuits. Over the next 500 years, they found almost 200 universities around the world, thousands of schools, thousands of ministries, apostolates, parishes, impacting probably hundreds of millions of lives. More recently, Mother Cabrini, movie came out about her recently. She came to the U.S. with nothing, didn't even speak the language. And within 25 years, she had founded 67 institutes, hospitals, orphanages, schools on 3 continents. So every 6 months, she was founding a new institute. And I could give you 100 other examples like that.
Wow. The second thing I want to do, just to frame our time today, is we're going to talk about 6 lessons from saint founders. We're going to drill down on them later, but if you can just kind of give the overview of the 6 right now.
Yeah, so did this research study looking at over 50 founders over a 2,000-year period who were fruitful in their lives and their works stood the test of time. Kind of identified about 6 themes or characteristics of these leaders. One, they put God first. God is first in their life. He breathes through their work and is very active in the Holy Spirit in their work in their life. They're not just working all the time or praying all the time, but they have time for community. They have very intentional kind of wellness practices for themselves. They're very deeply in touch with themselves and the world around them, surprisingly. They have this deep self-knowledge, and they have a surprising awareness of what's going on in the world. It's almost an intuitive awareness of what's going on in the world. Four, they emerge at the margins. They're often not in the papal office. They're not bishops. They're unexpected people in unexpected places. Five, they often start with the need in front of them. It's not some whiteboard, here's a strategy, let's go. It's like they see a need organically in their midst, and they work to address it with God. And they start in very small ways, and it grows usually very organically. And then lastly, you see this kind of impact and growth from what they're doing. There's a fruitfulness in their work, which is really a byproduct of the five inputs that I mentioned.
So, John, even as you say it right now, I'm living an experience I had a month or two ago when I was looking through these notes. Within those six, there are so many corollaries to modern entrepreneurs. Just for example, they know themselves and they know the world around them. I bet you and I could look at the better percentage of startups, whether in the Catholic world or secular world, and clearly see that the founder, was observing the world and saw what the need was. Of these six, how close are they to the modern entrepreneur experience? Do you think you can make a connector on each one?
Yeah, that's a great question. In a purely secular context, often God is not explicitly brought into the mix necessarily,
Sure.
and outside of that. But yeah, entrepreneurs, they take like Airbnb is a classic example of people that start with a need. They saw that there's this kind of housing challenge in New York, and they saw a need and they tried to address it, and they went door to door trying to figure out how to crack that code. And they were in touch with the broader market trends and things going on around them. And that they kind of emerged at the margins. I mean, who would have thought that
Sure.
these two guys in New York would start this, or like the Google founders, like very unexpected people. I think there are some themes in it, but the same founders, like their things are lasting for hundreds or thousands of years. And so allowing God and him into this, into their work, I think can yield more abundant fruitfulness over a sustained period of time, potentially.
We're going to give a handout at the end of the show that shows the six lessons that you mentioned that we're going to unpack a little bit more deeply. And I think it would be a good exercise for entrepreneurs who read them later to see how many they identify with. For example, John, one that was very obvious, at least to me, is they emerge from the margins. How many times, I think, have you and I seen over the past 30 years some new founder who probably was a little quirky, in some regards, and now they end up owning the world. So John, I haven't done this yet. What I'm going to ask you to do now, it's a lengthy story, but could you give us a quick overview of where you've come from and why you think you now see the world as you do because of those life experiences?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share some of my journey, and went to Notre Dame for undergrad, and I became very interested in, I always wanted to like make a difference, make an impact. And, but what does that mean? Right. And I became interested in politics and policy as a way to do that early on. So I actually, after college, worked for the governor, moved back to Alabama, where I'm from, worked for the governor of my home state doing political and policy work. And interestingly, ended up being pretty entrepreneurial there. Was able to kind of start some new programs and initiatives there, which was a good experience. So I've always had kind of that entrepreneurial drive. I had started a nonprofit in college too. And so it's always been I think a part of me a little bit. But I saw during that time kind of the limitations of government and policy and the bureaucracy and kind of the mixed motives of politics, let's just say. And I became more compelled by business as a kind of path to this impact and that sort of thing. And immediately after that, went to business school, studied an MBA at Harvard. And during that time, a lot of the momentum there is you got to go do investment banking or consulting or private equity. I mean, that's kind of what most people end up doing. So I ended up working in investment banking for a little bit and started a little consulting practice, advising companies on financial kind of restructuring and strategy, these types of things, and built a little kind of a micro consulting practice. But I was chasing worldly success in all these things, and it was a lot of kind of selfish ambition in it, and not in a good place spiritually, not in a good place. And I think God was just very generous with me. And about a year after business school, I had a very intense spiritual experience that just changed everything. And most probably powerful and intense experience in my life. And afterwards, I mean, literally went from reading Wall Street Journal and Economist, just like tearing through spiritual books. And also I was reading like Buddhist, Hindu, Christian stuff. And but found within that this deep mystical tradition within Catholicism that it had no idea about. Language of seeking an intimacy with God and a closeness with him that just really spoke to this experience that I had, this maybe encounter I had with him. And I found a lot of healing in confession, found a lot of healing in Mass, and started going to Mass every day. Started spending more time in prayer. And then I wanted to give everything to God. And so I started discerning religious life and ended up entering the Carmelites, which is a more contemplative order in the church. Was with them for over 7 years in formation in monasteries, and was able to do seminary studies for philosophy and theology, which I really enjoyed also. And eventually I felt like God was inviting me to kind of like dig up those things that I had buried. I'd buried like the professional stuff and and like use those gifts. And I became very interested in how the church had renewed throughout history. It's the churches and our faith's in crisis now. It had transformed my life.
Mm-hmm.
It has the opportunity to transform billions of lives out there. Being an entrepreneur, kind of intrinsically, I kind of maybe had a little bit of that bias. And so I looked at founders who had led new movements in the church. A lot of leadership studies on business figures, political, sports figures. What about people that have launched things that have lasted over 1,000 years? Like that's kind of interesting. What's in their DNA? What are their characteristics? And kind of became very compelled by this thesis of Catholic entrepreneurship as a vehicle for renewal, and then like seeing that there are ecosystems and support for entrepreneurs in every sector of the economy, whether it's Silicon Valley, governments have ecosystems for entrepreneurship even, but there's almost nothing in the Catholic space. And I was like, well, if this is how the church has renewed historically in many ways, how do we adapt that?
Yeah, and Sent really, I think, is going to be a very, very serious change agent for the church. It's a curiosity. It's in the world, but not of the world. I'm actually a member of Sent, and I just finished my year-long cohort with another 6 or so founders. As you're talking there about your Carmelite background, your business background, I'm seeing both the sacred and the secular. Talk to me, John. What do you think it is in the DNA of these Catholic entities that have been built to last? That's Jim Collins's follow-up book to Good to Great, was called Built to Last. But, in the church, these things are really built to last. What do you think is in the DNA of these Catholic constructs that are causing them to last 500 to 1,500 years?
Yeah, I think these 6 themes I've pointed out are part of the recipes of the founders. And the founders, these kind of these movements or orders are often birthed through the founders' journey and how the Holy Spirit is kind of activated in their lives. And so the Holy Spirit kind of breathing through in relationship with these founders in their place and time. You take Mother Teresa, for example. She's in the 1940s in Calcutta, which there were millions of refugees from Bangladesh. There was a war going on. There were millions of refugees coming from Bangladesh during the time. I mean, literally, there are pictures of Calcutta at the time where like you go outside and they're just like dead bodies in the street. I mean, it was that poor and that extreme. And so she's in this environment, and she's a teacher in a school with the Sisters of Loretto, and she's seeing this. And so she asked permission on her day out just to go and help people and serve them. And the order, she sees in that the vast needs of people, and she's doing that for years before she feels called into this deeper mission of building the Missionaries of Charity to kind of basically replicate herself across the world, to bring light to the poorest of the poor. Even the habit that she chooses for the Missionaries of Charity is related to the sari, right? The traditional Indian dress in that place and time. And so it's that beautiful relationship of how God is working through these leaders and these founders, but in their place and time, related to their experience. Ignatius builds the Jesuits, but he, I think, leverages a lot of his military experience for that. He kind of sends them off almost like Navy SEALs into different missional territories, and the order and the structure of them is, I think, reflective of his experience. They're able to tap into the zeitgeist of their time, like a prevailing spirit in the culture of their time and place. So you think of Francis, like he wasn't the first to kind of embrace a radical poverty at the time. They called him the Poverello, the poor man, and he had this kind of radical, that's part of the charism of the order. That was also part of the spirit of the time. You look at the Waldensians or the Albigensians, which were radical groups that slightly preceded Francis, and they had those elements to their kind of spiritual approach to things. So that was in the air, at the time. Ignatius sending his missionaries off to distant countries. I mean, this was in the wake of the discovery of the New World, and like part of the idea of the European or the Spanish consciousness, especially for men at the time, was like to go off to be a conquistador, to go off to the New World and like get gold and riches, and that was part of the hopes and dreams. And I think he was able to tap into that a little bit and say, hey, don't just be a conquistador for gold, be a conquistador for souls.
So again, re-looking at this question, why have they been built to last? Do you think it's rooted in this, I would humbly say, Catholic balance? The church tends to always drop in the center and be balanced. Do you think it's rooted in this balance of grace and nature? In other words, clearly it was the Holy Spirit behind the Benedictines, but on a natural level, they built a rule, and that rule is existing today. So do you think maybe part of that answer is rooted in just the 1-2 punch of grace and nature?
So I think the Franciscans, didn't really have many systems at all at the beginning. Wow. Francis was such an authentic figure in Christ. Some say he was like the most Christ-like person other than Christ to ever existed. And so there's such an authenticity and a holiness there. But also he has subsequent leaders that come after him that work to kind of systematize and create some order and bound this thing a little bit. So I do think that, creating those systems and those structures, which are necessary for institutional, continuing an institution.
So John, let's unpack each of the 6 individually and maybe tease them out a little bit. So the first one of the 6 is seek God first.
So I looked at some of the data behind these founders, like how old were they when they, first had their kind of deepening of their call, and then how old were they when they founded their, and it's interesting, the average age of them founding was about 37. And the average age of their like deepening of their conversion, maybe when they entered religious life, or they had, Ignatius had his conversion experience, was around 27. So it was an average of about a 10-year gestation period between when they had a deepening of their conversion experience and when they founded. There's like a long period where they're not really thinking about founding something for most of them. They're just trying to grow closer to God and like be faithful to Him. And there's like this training ground that's going on, and then a fruitfulness emerges. They're called into something deeper later on, and so that's an indication, I think, that they're really seeking God first in things, and then there's a deepening of that call later on to found something or start something. I want to be practical for the audience and for people and like myself. It's like, well, what does that actually look like for me and my work, my day? It's like, it's probably we spent hours a day praying, 2 hours for mental prayer, by contemplative prayer every day. And I can't do that now, but I can, I can't go to mass every day, and I can commit to 30 minutes of mental prayer a day. And several of the saints kind of have this consensus around, hey, you need at least like 20, 30 minutes a day for quiet meditation, prayer. I think people almost instinctively recognize the need that they need something else beyond just like working nonstop at some point.
Sure. Let's talk about the second one, be whole. What are you saying here?
Yeah, so go back to St. Benedict's interesting case study here too. Like if the Benedictine motto, if you will, is ora et labora, prayer and work. And we can often, I think when we think about a lot of the saints, we think of like, oh, they're just praying all the time, or they're working all the time, or they're just praying and working all the time. And that's not the case. They're actually create more integrated lives that allow them to sustain their very intense missions over a period of time. So in the rule of Benedict, they have intentional community time with the brothers. They live in community. That's core to the charism, if you will, in the rule. They also talk about dedicated times for rest and sleep. Before I entered religious life, I spent a month volunteering with the Sisters of Calcutta, and I thought like, these sisters are just like working on the streets and praying all the time. And they actually only have about 6 to 7 hours in their schedule for work each day. And the rest of the time is prayer, kind of a rest, a personal time in the early afternoon. And then they have tea about 3, kind of an English Indian custom.
John, I'm not sure that I ever stopped in the 23 years at Ascension to have tea. So I'm going to take these words,
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, they start back at work about 3 till, for another work block in the afternoon, and then they go back to prayer, and they're really strict on that. I mean, they have people knocking on their doors, and they're strict about protecting that time for prayer and community life. But they're also, when they work, they're going out to the gutters and picking up people that are, being consumed by rats and lice and bringing them back in. I mean, it's very hard work.
Sure.
To sustain that over a period of time in a way that you're still being Christ to others. It's this kind of integrated approach. So they are more whole than you would think, which allows that kind of ability to sustain the marathon. And it's not just like a year-long sprint.
So let me recalibrate. you did a study on 50 saint founders. You came away with 6 lessons. The first one was seek God first. The second one was be whole. The third one is know yourself and your world. What are you saying here? What did you discover here?
Yeah. So Teresa of Avila said to advise her sister, she said, sisters, even if you're raised to the heights of heaven, I would never want you to relax your growth in self-knowledge. So basically she's saying, even if you're basically a saint, you can still know more about yourself. And it's through knowing about ourselves. God's designed each of us uniquely, which is beautiful. And to the extent we're aware of who we are and how he's designed us, we're much more capable of loving others, ourselves, and God more fully. And so they have a deep understanding and awareness of themselves. And they also surprisingly in touch with their world around them. You think that Ignatius goes off to a cave after his conversion. He's actually kind of in touch with the broader world and the cultural trends that are going on. Men especially are wanting to go to these distant places to seek conquest and riches, etc. And he taps into that, I think. It's that awareness of self and the broader world that I think helps to amplify their impact and relevance at the time.
So the application here to modern entrepreneurs, not just those doing Catholic work, but secular work, is know yourself, know your world. And this may sound kind of mundane, but John, I've thought about this many times. They say most inventions come from people who are working in a given field. They know their field, and they see something broken in that field. Like, for example, a plumber. He's been doing plumbing for years, and he always thought that it would be good to have a wrench that did X, Y, or Z. Know yourself, know your world. This is what entrepreneurs do. They observe the world and they create.
Like it's a both-and integration.
Yeah. And I love that kind of dualism of, in the world, of the world, both and. To me, these are fabulous Catholic principles. Again, the church seems to always come down in the center with that both and. Okay, number 4, they emerge from the margins. Tell us what you discovered here.
These people exist. They often are in unexpected places and unexpected times. You wouldn't have called it, I could have called that one, and it's not like an organized, it's rarely a organized church strategy for addressing something. I mean, that can happen, and that's a good thing, can be a good thing. But Saint Francis of Assisi, who kind of reformed the monastic model to what became the new movement of the Middle Ages, was the mendicant movement. It's basically taking monasticism to the streets. And he emerged in this town of Assisi, but it wasn't even Assisi. He was like outside of Assisi in a sack, living in the woods, And so you see that with Jesus too, right? He was a marginal Jew, born in a stable in a town. What good can come from Nazareth, and born in Bethlehem. And this theme is very prevalent. And so, and I think it's super interesting because you also have like theologians comment on this too, like Ratzinger, Pope Benedict Ratzinger comments on this, as well as Hans von Balthasar, another major 20th century theologian. And they talk about it to get a little geeky on the theology side, the charismatic versus the hierarchical church, and that the hierarchical church is, kind of the typical church structures, parishes, dioceses, etc. Kind of the sacramental life and kind of the organization of the church is the institutional church. The charismatic church is often where the church is renewed in fresh ways in different places in time through unique people. And they both observe that this often happens outside of the hierarchical church. And it's interesting, you see this in entrepreneurs too, even secular entrepreneurs. Large companies want to have an innovation group. They set it up as a separate thing. We had a case study in business school about this on one of the entrepreneurship classes I took. Like, if you have the entrepreneurship or the innovation units in your bureaucratic large corporate building, it just gets drowned out by the bureaucracy and the culture. And so you need to set it up as a separate thing, even a separate company with separate leadership. There's very much a parallel in the entrepreneurship realm as well, I think.
Yeah, John, I actually thought, separate from that idea that you just shared, corporations setting up separate endeavors. I've heard the phrase skunk works. I actually thought you were going to go in a different direction with this number 4, where it says they emerge from the margins. I think many of the founders were just different when they were young. Some of them may have been on the spectrum. You hear about Richard Branson, who had, it was dyslexic. And if you think yourself a little bit different, that actually may be just the ticket. John, let's go to number 5. Start with the need. What are you saying there? What did you discover there?
Yeah, so they often identify a need around them, and they just feel compelled to start addressing it. And it's not, some big whiteboard strategy of let me start this thing. It's like, oh, here's a need in my midst. I feel compelled because of the gospel to do something about this. Don Bosco is a great example of this. He's a priest in Turin, Italy in the late 1800s. So you think of the context of the time, kind of a post-industrial era. So people are moving to cities, and there are a lot of kind of orphan or street boys at the time. So kids without kind of regular employment. They're not in school. They don't have parents. They don't have kind of like guides, and they're getting in trouble a lot. They're causing a lot of trouble in the city. And he feels compelled to just help one of those boys, just kind of be a father to him and a spiritual mentor, and then help get him a job, train him a little bit. And he does it with another boy. And then he's like, well, let's start like a little school. And within 100 years, he founds the Salesians, but it ends up being the second largest congregation in the church. And that wasn't his goal to be, but that's how it emerges. And I think you see that very much in secular entrepreneurs too.
No doubt, no doubt. So number 6, what are you saying with impact and growth? What did you find in your research?
Yeah. And it gets back to our conversation earlier about like productivity versus fruitfulness. I mean, these missions are quite fruitful over time. There are a lot of people that join these congregations, these orders, these movements. There are a lot of institutions or communities that are founded or started. There are a lot of people that are touched or impacted by this work. And so it happens over a sustained period of time. And so that fruitfulness is, I think it's a marker that you're kind of, that they're on the right track. You see that in secular entrepreneurs too. I mean, the fruitfulness thing, you have to be careful, like drawing a total parallel, but, that when someone has a product market fit and they're serving an audience well at the right price, like, things grows, right? And it's impactful. And I'll add one more story to this. One of my favorite stories in the Acts of the Apostles, Pentecost, which probably should be everyone's favorite. At Pentecost, they're first going out and preaching that 3,000 more were added to the church that day. 3,000 more were added to the church that day. So you're seeing at this same moment of Pentecost, which is this mystical kind of birth of the church, and the Holy Spirit's fanning out the apostles to the ends of the earth. You're also seeing a metric.
Sure.
At the same time for fruitfulness and impact.
I see you. I find myself always apologizing a little bit when we're mixing the sacred and the profane. In other words, these concepts from the Lord, but they do have connectors in everyday life, and they are what they are. Some of them will be a stretch, but actually I'm not surprised at how often the connectors are there, because the Lord is the Lord of the universe, which means all the things of the world are under his dominion and in many regards connected. So John, I think we're actually in a special springtime right now of the church, but what is unique about Sent is that it's not only a new apostolate, but it's a multiplier apostolate. Can you share who Sent is, what you're hoping to do, and what impact you've seen so far?
I became compelled by this idea of Catholic entrepreneurship. And at first I was like, well, let's just raise a fund, and then we can like back these founders and grow them. And then when I started asking around, people were like, well, who are you going to invest in, or what? It's like, well, that's a good point. I don't know who these companies are or where they are. And it became clear to me that what's needed, and you look at any movement in church history and or new thing that is trying to serve people, is trying to allow the Holy Spirit and God into the work. At its core, they're communities. Think of koinonia. It's like the apostles were which is the Greek for like Christian community. I mean, so it's community at the core. And so I was like, really what's the thing that is most needed and authentic, either whether it's from a business perspective or a spiritual perspective, is this community and relationship. And so try to find ways of building a community of Catholic founders and entrepreneurs in a way that really served their needs and spoke into their kind of pain points and desires of their heart. So we started with building cohorts, kind of adapting model that's used by Young Presidents Organization and others, like where they have cohorts of CEOs and founders that basically support and advise each other, getting help and advising each other on your business, on your personal lives and your spiritual life, and have that be very ordered and structured, because entrepreneurs are very busy and they have very limited time. So we kind of created a model that worked very well and for Catholic founders and entrepreneurs in community. And so we've replicated that. We've kind of built out upon that too, and have different kind of membership levels for founders. So if people want to go deep, there's the Sent Fellowship. If they don't have a lot of time or they just want to kind of interface in a lighter way, we have what's called Essential membership, and you can access regular mentoring sessions for everything from these prominent VCs to Fortune 500 CEOs to spiritual directors, and just chime in and get guidance and feedback on what you're doing, and also network with a broader community of Catholic founders and leaders who are interested in these things. And we found that the virtual world is great in COVID especially, but there's a deep hunger to be in person. And that's part of our being incarnate, is that we desire to be in person with each other. So we started a summit, in-person gathering a couple years ago, and have our third one. So it's a gathering for hundreds of founders and CEOs and investors. And we start with sacraments and prayer. And we also have community time and content. And so we try to integrate these kind of be whole pieces even within our events and in our community as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have totally benefited from it. The conferences, the year-long cohorts, the curriculum, the tools within it, the self-assessment tool alone I thought was fabulous. And then, John, there is that intangible of when you're running a company, there is an element where it is lonely. And even if you have multiple staff, because you face often different problems. And Sent, to me, has been, through a cohort and just individual conversations, a place where I could, talk about challenges that were being faced. So Sent is a gift. And what is the URL that people can go to? We'll have it in the show notes, but if you could just rattle it off here.
Yeah, so sentventures.com is our main website. So if you want to learn more about what we do or who we are, definitely check that out, sentventures.com.
Great. John, one last question, and I'm always fascinated with sociological questions. I think I'm seeing again, and it's really a third or a fourth movement in the past 40 years of church work, a movement happening. If someone goes to a Sent conference, you can hear the energy. Do you see or do you speculate that maybe a new Catholic movement of entrepreneurship, of apostolic zeal, of movement of the Spirit, any or all of those, do you think something is happening right now? And if so, what gives you that sense?
You have a better historical perspective on this than I do, and I feel maybe I'm too in it and too innately biased to really comment on something like that. And so, but at the same time, yeah, I can speak from my experience at the summit, and there's a tremendous energy and vitality around it. And I mean, the feedback that we get from the summit, we do surveys afterwards, and it would be like basically in the top 2% of companies, the feedback people give for the summit. And it's been growing, doubling each year in terms of attendance and size and energy. And so the idea behind this ecosystem or this community network is to create this space where companies and organizations can have that liftoff and really build faith into their ventures and address key problems and challenges in the world with God and the Holy Spirit. Because it's very hard to start anything, but especially if you're trying to build your faith into it, because there's not the infrastructure and support for it. So we want to create the space where more companies and organizations like that can see the light of day, grow, and transform culture and society.
Very good, John. You're playing a fabulous role. Thanks be to God. You identified a need, as you say, even in your research, you identified your own need, and with God's grace, number 6, fruitfulness is coming from it. So praise be to the Lord for the good work you're doing. Well, John, great stuff. Thank you for your time. I look forward to having you back again. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's been a blessing.
Very good. Thanks, John. So what a unique concept that one is a saint, but you're allowed to be entrepreneurial. In fact, the church celebrated the entrepreneurial spirit of those saints, contributing to their canonization. For those of us who run ministries and businesses, it really should give us, as I said earlier, a great hope that you can have that spirit and yet fully be committed and live for the Lord. I want to thank our sponsor of the show, Mission Advantage. If you're looking to place a senior level position in your Catholic ministry, Mission Advantage is your solution. You can find contact information in the show notes below. Also, we'd love for you to follow us on whichever platform you are listening to the Catholic Entrepreneur podcast on. Like us where you can, when they allow that. Also, we'd love to have you on our mailing list. We'll be sharing the PDF from today's show for free with you. You can download it for free. We're just starting this. We're giving away a couple of our Catholic Entrepreneur mugs each month for free. We're going to randomly select 3 names from people from our email list. So it would be great if you could go to catholicentrepreneur.org and sign up for our email list. Thank you again for being with me on the Catholic Entrepreneur podcast.